It was one of the murkiest moments in a war already full of them. On September the 26th, 2022, seismic monitors in Sweden recorded a series of powerful impacts somewhere out in the Baltic Sea. Shortly afterwards, a stream of bubbles surfaced near the Danish island of Bornholm, roiling a large patch of water. It didn't take long to find out the cause of these twin disturbances. That evening, far below the sea's surface, explosions had torn through the Nord Stream pipelines, bringing gas from Russia to Germany. 3 of the 4 pipelines had ruptured, rendering them unusable. Coming at a time of extreme geopolitical tension, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines generated no shortage of suspects. Russia blamed the US and the UK, claiming it was an attempt to deprive the Kremlin of energy revenue. Western officials, by contrast, blamed Russia, noting that the sabotage had coincided with Moscow cutting off energy supplies to Europe as punishment for supporting Ukraine. Others pointed the finger at everyone, from Ukrainian sabotage groups to the Polish governments, which had long railed against German energy dependency on Russia. In the near 2 years since the pipeline blasts, multiple bodies have tried to solve the mystery. Sweden and Denmark both investigated what the Financial Times calls the suspicious movements of Russian military vessels in the area, only to drop their cases for lack of evidence. Journalists, too, have tried to get involved, producing theories that have ranged from the plausible to the truly absurd. Yet in all that time, no one seemed to get any closer to the real truth about what happened that September day. That is until now. In the sort of blockbuster report for which the term bombshell is usually reserved, the Wall Street Journal revealed on August the 14th the results of a long German-led investigation into the bombings. Berlin's conclusion? The destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines was ordered and overseen by the highest echelons of the Ukrainian government. In other words, the recipient of billions of euros in German aid is thought to have deliberately destroyed German energy infrastructure. Amazingly, that's not even the most amazing part of the journal's story. In a twisted tale that reads like something from a spy thriller, the article, backed up by joint reporting in German outlets like Die Zeit, suggested that German ally Poland may have helped the sabotage team involved escape justice. If true, this would likely represent the biggest internal crisis NATO has faced in decades. It would also call into question German support for Ukraine at a time when Kiev is trying to take the fight to Russia. Now, we'll come on to the evidence for the journal's version of events later in the video. For now, though, we want to just quickly sketch out what exactly the Nord Stream pipelines were and how they may come to have been viewed as legitimate military targets. Coming online in 2011, Nord Stream 1 was a pair of pipelines designed, in their most basic sense, to bring gas to Germany directly from Russia. In a wider sense, they were also supposed to help tie the fortunes of Moscow to Europe, to integrate Russia into the continent and continue the trade through change policy Germany had started pursuing back in the Cold War. Now, if all of this sounds relatively benign, you should know the reality was extremely controversial. Nations like Poland and Ukraine warned that Berlin was putting its energy security in Russia's hands. At the same time, gas going via Nord Stream was gas not being pumped overland through Ukraine's old pipelines, denying Kiev transit fees worth billions of dollars. Then there was the additional controversy surrounding Nord Stream 2. Constructed after the 2014 annexation of Crimea, it was seen by some as Berlin rewarding Moscow for its aggression. The Trump White House even slapped sanctions on the pipeline to stop its completion, although the Biden White House ultimately allowed it to go ahead. That it was never activated is due entirely to Russia launching its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. By the start of the war then, the Nord Stream pipelines were seen by some Eastern European states as both a geopolitical affront and also as an existential threat to Ukraine, a way for Moscow to gain leverage over Europe's largest economy while also depriving Kiev of transit fees equivalent to 4% of GDP. Of course, Germany was not alone in getting hooked on cheap Russian energy. The Financial Times reports that by early 2022, the Kremlin supplied 46% of the EU's gas imports. Today, it's more like 15%. But it was Berlin that Vladimir Putin would be first to target with his energy weapon. In the summer of 2022, flows through Nord Stream plummeted. Moscow claimed it was due to a faulty turbine, but most observers thought Putin was punishing Berlin for backing Ukraine. This is why the Kremlin was a suspect in the aftermath of the pipeline bombings. To many, the destruction of Nord Streams 1 and 2 appeared to be Putin burning his bridges with the West in the most dramatic way possible. Yet there was one place where the idea of Russian sabotage never gained much traction: Berlin. A couple of months before the blasts, the CIA had passed along a tip-off from Dutch intelligence that Ukraine was plotting to destroy the pipelines. Now they lay in ruins. Germany was certain Kiev must have been involved. And it's here that the established facts in our narrative start to merge with the story reported by the Wall Street Journal. A story that is contested even by some in Germany's intelligence agencies, as well as one that is angrily denied by Ukraine. Now, we happen to think it's important we report the story to you as the Journal published it. Even if it turns out to be incorrect, it's what a large chunk of German officials currently believe, and that will likely have geopolitical consequences. But just bear in mind that a lot of what you're about to hear is as yet uncorroborated. Whether you find it plausible or not, well, that's up for you to decide, isn't it? According to the Journal, the plot was hatched in May of 2022, when senior officers in Ukraine's military and a group of businessmen gathered to celebrate the withdrawal of Russian forces from Kiev. After a few too many drinks, someone apparently suggested a way to inflict further damage on the Kremlin by destroying Nord Stream. At the time, European nations were still handing over billions of dollars for Russian gas. Were Nord Stream 2 ever activated, Moscow would gain billions more. Blowing up the pipelines would therefore be an easy way to hurt the Kremlin's wallet. And here's where the story gets controversial. According to the report, the general overseeing the mission reported directly to the Ukrainian army's then overall commander, Valery Zaluzhny. Zaluzhny, in turn, took the idea directly to President Zelensky, who personally approved the plan. At least, at first he did. According to the Journal, when the CIA learned of the plot, they demanded Zelensky abort. Zelensky agreed and ordered Zaluzhny to call it off. It was an order that the general would fail to follow. For details of what happened next, we're turning to an account from German paper Die Zeit. In their telling, the sabotage team Zaluzhny had dispatched rented a sailing yacht, the Andromeda, and set off from the German town of Rostock. Under the guise of a boating holiday, the team eventually crossed the location of the Nord Stream pipelines. There, they dived down to a depth of 80 meters and attached explosives. Not long after, on the evening of September the 26th, the first charges detonated. The evidence Die Zeit provides that the crew on board the Andromeda were responsible is long, and it is fairly convincing, ranging from DNA traces to cellular data to accounts from eyewitnesses who just so happened to encounter the ship during its travels. But perhaps nothing is quite so damning as the following quote. Investigators later found residues of the explosive HMX, also known as Octogen, on board the Andromeda. As to how this was linked back to Ukraine, well, a white van connected to the boat trip was caught by a speed camera on the German island of Rügen. The FT reports that it was carrying diving equipment used during the operation. Sat in the front passenger seat was none other than Volodymyr Zhiralov, a 44-year-old diving instructor from Kiev who was living in Poland. Zhiralov's possible connection to the Andromeda was enough for German authorities to issue an arrest warrant for him this June. Berlin believes it was received by Polish authorities who then failed to act on it. Rather than be arrested, Zhiravolov freely crossed the border into Ukraine in July. Since Ukraine does not extradite its own citizens, it's now unlikely that the arrest warrant will ever be served. Speaking anonymously, German officials have complained to the media that this wasn't the only time Polish authorities hampered their investigation. CCTV footage of the Andromeda at a port in Poland was requested by Berlin, only for Warsaw to reply that the footage had been destroyed. The suspicion in some quarters is that Poland may now be helping Ukraine hide the truth of what happened that fateful September day. August Hanning, the former head of Germany's intelligence agency, has even been quoted by Deutsche Welle as saying Warsaw was heavily involved in the preparation of this attack. So you can see what we mean about this story being a little bit of a political bombshell. Although Hanning is long retired, the mere accusation that a NATO ally may have helped plot an attack on German infrastructure is as incendiary as a bathtub of napalm. But is there more to this story than simple accusations? Could it be the truth, or is it nothing more than an overbaked spy thriller, the modern equivalent of gullible Western journalists reprinting Soviet propaganda? Perhaps unsurprisingly, it depends on which side you already stand on. Poland and Ukraine, for example, have issued denials bordering on contemptuous. Here's Polish Deputy Prime Minister Krzysztof Kowalski commenting on the accusations of Warsaw's involvement. It has to be said clearly that this is a lie. I think this is Russian disinformation resonating through the words of German politicians. Meanwhile, here is one of Ukraine's presidential aides telling AFP that, quote, Ukraine's involvement in the Nord Stream explosions is absolute nonsense. There was no practical sense in such actions for Ukraine. It is clear the explosions of the Nord Stream pipelines did not stop the war, did not deter Russian aggression, and did not affect the situation on the front line. Now, to be clear, it's not only authorities in Poland and Ukraine who think the journal's story is Russian-backed bunkum. Politico recently reported on senior German intelligence officials who are worried the whole thing is an elaborate false flag attack designed by Russia to sap Western support for Ukraine. The Polish authorities are confident enough in this explanation that they've even compiled a list of Russian agents involved. As a result, it's hard to say for sure that the mystery has now been solved. While the German story is compelling, until some hard evidence emerges, it will remain merely that, a story. Yet, as we mentioned earlier, at this stage, the truth may not really matter. What matters is that German intelligence believes it has the answer, believes that Ukraine committed an act of war against its energy infrastructure, an act of war that it suspects may have been abetted by its NATO ally Poland. Should this become the dominant view among German politicians, it's hard to see how it couldn't have massive consequences. So far, everyone is being careful to keep those consequences below the radar. DW reports that Berlin has so far, quote, insisted its military help to Ukraine was completely independent from the Nord Stream probe and its ties to Kiev are unaffected. Really though, no one believes that one won't affect the other. Die Zeit, for example, finished its in-depth report on the revelations by asking what would happen if Ukrainians were actually behind the attack. Would the ambassador have to be summoned? Would the arms deliveries be stopped? How would one deal with a country that destroyed the infrastructure that Germany wanted to use to supply itself with gas? Now, fairly or unfairly, these are questions that are not going to be going away anytime soon. And unless Ukraine or Poland could produce a counter-narrative that quietens German suspicions, then these questions are only going to grow more pressing as more time passes. Because, as things stand today, Berlin is in an increasingly awkward position. The bombing of the Nord Stream pipelines may have been just one murky event in a war full of them, but it could yet become something else too. An event that could shape relations between Ukraine and her second biggest military backer at one of the war's most crucial turning points.